This video will cover the last part of land value. We will be talking about police coverage and residential minutes. Now, in the very first video that I made, I think one of the biggest observations you might have seen is, aside from the police department headquarters, there's hardly any police departments, regular ones. And if I go to the total screen, which we've seen before, you will notice that I only have 10 police departments. Now, again, 3 of those are gifts, so I really only have 7 regular police departments. But again, if you look at this map, and you look at the lack of police departments, and then you look at, let's say, the crime map, you're like, oh my gosh, like how was I able to get anything to even develop? Well, don't forget all the things that I've told you in the previous videos. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to a picture of the empty map. Like I have nothing on it. And we're just going to do a little bit of drawing on it so that I get you to understand kind of on the surface why I only have the number of police departments that I have. Okay, so here is map 137, the map that I built my city on. Now, it could be any map, but for the sake of this example, I'm just going to use this map. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on it. When you're building a city, what do we know? Well, from what I've told you before, we know that these very outer edges of the map are going to be composed of commercial and industrial zones, like this. I'm just going to go through the water right there. Once you have that outer edge, you have the next layer, which is your residential donut blocks pushed against it. So we're just going to say that, and this is very crudely drawn, but we're going to say that all of this is your residential donut block area. Now, if you have your police department headquarters positioned in the spots that I had explained before when talking about gifts, you would know in my map I have a gift sticking out like right here, and I have a gift sticking out like right here. Police department down here too. Okay. Now bear in mind that everything that I've shaded does not require police coverage, right? Because the donut block creates high enough land value such that they don't care about the crime, right? The whole point of crime is that it decreases land value. But with the gifts, they create so much that it overpowers what the crime can do to your land value. And then on the very outer edge of the map, it's all commercial and industrial zones. Zones that don't care about crime at all. Okay, and we demoed this when we talked about residential, commercial, and industrial zones. So why would you want to ever put a police department on this outer edge like this when it's not necessary? Because police coverage, while it's nice for certain situations, is not going to do anything in this situation, right? In a police department, the actual zone has 0 population. And so that's why you don't put any on this outer edge. But you also shouldn't have to put any in this area right here. You shouldn't have to put any right here. Why? Because when you are completely done building, the city center has the highest land value. There's still going to be a lot of crime in the city center. And we'll go ahead and look at the crime map again when we jump back over, or the land value map, sorry, and the crime map. We'll look at both here in a minute. But because this circle is in the center of the city, it will be able to have just a high enough land value to maintain being tops in that area. Now, you can have tops in other places, but the ones in the center of the map will stay as tops because they'll have just enough land value. And this is mostly for the residential tops, right? Because commercial tops are immune to low land value. The residential tops will have just enough land value to sustain being residential tops after you move away from them, after you surround them with other zones and remove park. But do you notice what's left over in this picture? What have I not talked about? Well, and I'm going to use the color to kind of describe it. You have this like in between mysterious gray area right here. This kind of like in between area is where all of my police departments are positioned at. This is because this is neither in the center of the city, the edge of the map, or in a donut block. It's all of the other zones that don't fall into any of that. This is the outer ring of the city's center. And this is where you can get problems to occur. And this should only be where you ever have to put a police department because of the reasons I just told you before. So let's go ahead and look at the outer ring of my city, and we'll kind of talk about a few things there. Okay, so we're back in my city, and you've seen my city quite a few times, but the first thing I kind of want to jump to is, look at all of these tops. This is my city's center, and if I were to look at the land value map, well, I'll tell you what, let's look at the crime map first. Look at this. Tons of red in the city center. How could I possibly have all these nice tops? Specifically residential tops, because residential zones are sensitive to crime and pollution and low land value. How can I have all these tops here when I have all this crime? Well, if you look at this city center, do you notice anything? You should notice that the center of the map has the lightest shades of green. I think a big misconception that people might make is you can only have tops when you have the really high land value, orange or higher. And I mean, that makes sense why you would think that, because looking at all the other donut blocks here, they create such higher land value as far as colors go. But you don't need those colors to sustain, that's the key word here, sustain a residential top. Remember, when you're building like one zone at a time. You're trying to get the bonus land value. You're trying to put a police department temporarily to lower crime. You're trying to do everything you can to make the zone develop. And then you go to the next one, and let's say those two make our top, and we're in the center of the map. Once you start building around it, right, you're removing the police department, you're removing the park, it's not going to be red, oranges, and even yellow sometimes. You get this light green instead. Well, it turns out that this is just enough land value on this land value charts to sustain a residential top. It's like you could glue a residential top in the middle and it will maintain being a residential top as long as you're at a certain threshold for land value. And that threshold, as you can see, is these lighter shades of green, these two lighter shades of green. And actually, you notice like up here, those lighter shades of green also kind of go up here and look what I have on the map here. I have where these lighter shades of green are. I've packed in more tops because I had higher land value there when I was building. But those lighter shades of green also will prevent, let's say, these two tops from reverting back, or this top, residential top, from reverting back. Because even though there may be crime, we have just enough of the lighter greens in that area such that that won't be a problem for us. Now, again, in general, starting at the center of the top of the map and then diagonally drawing to the center of the sides and then diagonally drawing bottom right like this, the land value forms a diamond shape, and there's different like levels that you can see in the diamond shape, right? The center, you see the center diamond, that's my city center, has the best land value, not including gifts. But this diamond shape is actually why, let's say, there's like all this really high land value down here, because again, the point of the diamond actually would go kind of to the center, and it explains up here as well. Not so much on this side because there's water and it's kind of questionable over here, but this light green and then the ring around it is just enough land value to sustain my residential tops. That's all you need to know. So when I see the crime, you can't base what you're doing on this map. In all honesty, this map is actually really not that helpful at all, okay? Because it's telling you there's all this crime, but then you go to this map and you're like, okay, the land value outweighs the crime enough to where I don't lose any tops in the center here. But that's all you need to know about like why we don't have police coverage in the center. And I think should be easy for you to understand why we don't have police coverage on the outer edge, like I explained before. But the center, I kind of wanted to explain that one, because again, it's deceiving because you look at it and you're like, those aren't oranges and reds, and it's like, well, you don't need oranges and reds for sustainability. You need them for developing at the time you're making it, but for sustainability of residential zones, the light greens is all you need. The next thing I'd like to do is go to these police departments I have and explain why I have them here. Now, if I were to look at this police department and say, destroy it, and let's just replace it with a commercial zone, because for filler, okay. If I were to actually like run this, I want you to pay attention to what happens. So we're waiting. See that? Pause it. Did you just see this? This residential top broke apart. Why did it break apart? It has a valid destination on the left half, yet it broke apart. Well, the reason for this is because the police department was positioned in such a way that it lowered the crime just enough to not lower the land value below this kind of threshold. Because remember, I said in the center, there comes a point where, you're sustaining the land value enough to keep the residential sustained. But if you destroy this police department, what did that do? It increased crime in the area, which again, there might be a lot of crime on the map, but lowering the crime in a certain area, what is that going to do? It's going to help prevent the crime from lowering the land value even further, And this zone, or this residential top here, is not in the city center. It's on the outer ring. So it's going to be more susceptible to the crime that's around it because we're lowering the land value. This residential's top is probably teetering on being sustained and not being sustained. And by destroying the police department, it's kind of went below the threshold, and now it's doing that. I want you to notice that it went back to a top on its own. It could happen that the left side craps out to a lower mid. And if that were to happen, I would actually permanently lose a top. Okay, I'm going to pause because we noticed something else. I would permanently lose this top. So if you ever see a fluctuating residential top, it means you don't have enough land value for the left or top half of that top. And so there are a couple things you can do. You could try and create more areas of park, because park raises land value, or you could build a police department in that area. The other thing I want you to take notice here is, do you see this mid is fluctuating now? This is because mids, which we'll talk about here in a minute, are probably the most finicky and annoying zones in this entire game. But all you can think about them for now is they're very sensitive to crime and low land value. All residential zones are. And so when I removed the police department, what happened was that the land value lowered just enough in this spot to where now it's going to start fluctuating. And look at that. Another residential mid is fluctuating. So we have a couple residential mids fluctuating. Oh, we lost the top again. Goes back. It can't decide what it wants to be. But if it decides it doesn't want to be a top, in just one instance, we lose the top permanently. So a fluctuating residential top is not good. Nope, that one fluctuated up here. Okay, and so the whole point of the police department is more of a sustainability thing. Okay, this one's fluctuating pretty badly. And I have had residential tops lost in this way. So if I go back, open the save state again, and I look at this spot, you will notice that if I kind of fast forward here, you don't see the residential mids fluctuating. You don't see the residential top fluctuating. Because I was able to position the police department in just a way, in such a way that everything's happy, essentially. And in general, in this map here, I was extremely happy with my positioning of the police department because all of these residential tops and residential zones around it are maintained and sustained. And so all of this outer edge worked out really well. Now, I won't go through all of these police departments that I have, but if I destroy this one, what ends up happening is this residential top fluctuates, and then I've had it before where it fluctuates and then the top part craps out to a mid, and then I lost this top. And then these two mids fluctuate, okay? These commercial zones are not affected again. They're immune, but the key to these police departments is to try and protect your residential zone. Now, just to clarify something, I'm going to go back to the land value map here. And I said before that in the city center, which is composed of this light diamond and the kind of the band right outside it, all this, the reason I don't need a police department is because I have a high enough land value to sustain all these, right? The light greens provide just enough land value to where you don't need a police department. But one thing to also note is you can get tops to form in this gray area that we've been talking about. There's nothing wrong with being able to get tops here. I mean, if I look, there's a residential top right here. Going over here, I have a residential top. I have residential top. So is residential tops in this gray area. So it's not an area where you can't get any tops to develop. It's an area where the land value is teetering on having the residentials fluctuate, having the tops break off. And you notice that in this mysterious gray area again, the majority of the colors are the second darkest shade of green, right? But then, like I said earlier, up here we have more of the lighter shades, which is why I don't have a police department really, kind of like right here. And this is where I have a whole bunch of tops developed pretty nicely. So what we're trying to do is, okay, this outer ring right here that I'm circling is the gray area. And if my residential zones are going to be like borderline unstable, then what I'm trying to do at the police departments is position them in such a way that it keeps the land value just high enough to where they won't fluctuate. And so that is why the only spots on the map that I have my police departments is this gray area outer ring, because of the fact that it's not in the city center or it's not on the edge or a donut block. It's just the middle. And again, if I kind of just look at my map, again, I kind of go around the ring here, and then I had a nice patch of fairly decent land value. And then as I move over on this side, the land value starts to get dark again on the map. And so those were my police departments, or where my police departments would go. Now you might be wondering, I kind of said earlier on this one that I was able to position it just perfectly to where all of my zones, or all my residential zones, seem to be stable. How would you know where to position this police department? Well, the answer is I didn't know either. You basically have to just build, and then once you notice problems, then you go back and you try and position a police department in such a way that it kind of fixes the problem, right? So what I was doing when I was building was, I built this row, and then I would build this row, and everything was good with the zones here because there was park up here because I had not built yet. And then I built this row, and I noticed after I built this row that this R top started fluctuating, and it in fact had broken off at one point to a mid. And so, again, when you're doing this on a computer, you're saving the game's state, right? And I saved it multiple times. I have like 9 save states. So you always have backups. So you're like, okay, wait a minute. A problem is starting to occur. I need to go back and somehow fix this. Because at the end of the day, if you don't need a police department, then don't build one. Just because it's in the outer ring doesn't mean you feel obligated to put a police department, right? Just put one when a problem occurs. Because looking at this residential top here, in these mids here, after I built this row, I didn't have a problem. It didn't fluctuate, so I didn't put a police department in this area. Makes sense? I just kind of put one as soon as I found a problem. And in general, you want the least amount of police departments as possible while also keeping your zones protected. That's kind of what you're going for. 7 to 8 seems to be the magic number of police departments I've always been able to get. And now in this case, not counting headquarters again, I built this megalopolis, which is 7, but it really depends on the map layout and how you're going to lay everything out. Make sense? So that's really all I have to say about the police department itself. The only other thing I'll say about it is, you remember that a police department can be used as a valid destination. So if you want to do a small optimization, you would probably want to put it where you can give residential zones a valid destination. Remember, commercial zones, while they're nice, it means that there's a better chance that the commercial demand will crap out because we're building so many as is. So if there's a spot where you can instead say, okay, I need a police department anyway, let me just use that for a valid destination for my residential zones, then I would definitely do that. And you can see that here, right? This is a valid destination for 3 residential zones, right? And then this is a valid destination for this R upper. The only time I didn't actually do that was over here. But the reason that I had made this happen is because in order for me to pack as many zones as possible while trying to stabilize everything, it kind of worked out at the time to just make this or stick this right here with no possible way to get tracked to it. But as you can see, I still had a problem here. So that's going to be the next kind of big thing we're going to talk about in this video. So again, before we move on, that's all you want to do with police departments. That's how you want to go about it. And remember when we talked about gifts, as a quick reminder here, see these police department headquarters, I try to position as close to this mysterious gray outer ring area as possible to try to radiate the police coverage out to it. And again, we already talked about that, but radiating to the outer ring. And they're always in the corner of the map or positioned near the corner, again, because the corners of the map had the lowest land value, right? So that's where I put them. But then we talked about how putting them in the very back isn't going to help because then the police coverage, you won't really take advantage of it. The next thing I want to talk about now is the residential mids. Now, residential mids are notorious for being very finicky. They can fluctuate. And you might be wondering why they fluctuate all the time. Looking at my city, there's one. The game's paused, by the way, but there's a residential mid that is not developed all the way. Here's another residential mid that's not developed all the way. And here's a residential mid that's not developed all the way. In total, I counted and I found 11 fluctuating mids. Now, that's actually really bad. Okay, that's terrible. Now, I may have gotten 911,200, but that is way more than I ever expected to get. I could have technically had a higher population. You see, just because you build a residential mid doesn't mean you magically can say you get 800 population. You have to actually be able to develop it, right? So I spent, and I believe I talked about this, but if not, I'm going to restate it again. I believe I fast forwarded the game for hours. And what I was trying to do was trying to pause the game in such a way that I had as many fully developed mids as possible. Because when you're talking about getting a record, you can't just say, yeah, if it were to fully develop, then I have 800 and I'm just going to count it as 800. You can't really do that, right? So you have to kind of just fast forward, and then it's okay to pause it once they're fully developed and say, yeah, that's what I got. But when you have 11 fluctuating mids, it's almost impossible to get them all to stay fully developed at the exact same time. If I were to get them all to fully develop at the exact same time, it's 911,800 something, which is teetering closer to 912,000. But because I couldn't get them all to fully developed, I just took what I got. And this just goes to show you, like, I know what I'm talking about, and I had 11 fluctuating mids. And there's reasons for this, but what you really, really want to do when you're building is you need to try to, like, not make them fluctuate. So why do I have fluctuating mids? Why are these mids finicky? Why do they go up and down? Why don't they just stay as fully developed mids? And see, there's one here. So I'll just kind of fast forward. And this one's even more mysterious because it's like literally sandwiched between 3 police departments. So why isn't it staying stable? From my understanding, there's 2 reasons for this. Now, I'm going to be upfront with you and say that I have a fairly good idea on why the mids fluctuate, but I can't say that I'm 100% sure on it. The first reason, which I researched a bit on the GameFAQs message board, is that the game is programmed to try and mimic the idea that, you move into a house and then people eventually move somewhere else, right? So the game tries to mimic the idea of moving in and out. And if you have a really nice residence, like an upper or high, then you're not going to move. That's why you don't ever see uppers or highs fluctuate. I don't know if that's entirely true. I have no proof on it. But that was an idea at the time that was brought up on the message board. Was the game is programmed such that if you're in like middle land value, just average land value, your mids will fluctuate to mimic the idea of, hey, this isn't really the best residence. Let's live here for a little bit and move out. Make sense? Now, let's just assume that wasn't true. If that wasn't true, then what my understanding from playing is for why residential mids fluctuate is because, well, number one, they're a residential zone. And the number 2, they're sitting in low land value, right? This is the second lowest you can be, the lowest being this dark green, right? And most of the mids actually sit in this second lowest color. It seems as though if you have a fluctuating mid, it means that, yes, I have, let's say here, 3 police departments, but it doesn't have a high enough land value around it to be stable. That's why over here, you notice like I have these big blotches of park around these mids. Well, these 4 mids actually are stable. They don't fluctuate. I've never seen them fluctuate. But this one does. And actually this one doesn't fluctuate either. All this park around it is bringing in land value that increases it just enough to where it won't fluctuate. And so the idea behind why this one is not behaving is, it kind of makes sense because, yeah, we have police coverage, but police coverage does not imply that it's going to fully develop. It just means you're increasing the likelihood that the land value won't get dropped by crime. But notice this one has literally no park around it. If I were to be able to put even one tile of park by it, it might be the difference between it being stable and it being unstable. What I also have kind of discovered while building is if you have a residential mid and you could place park in the bonus land value square, you're way more likely to actually stabilize it. This residential mid here could have easily been pushed to the right here. Okay, now valid destination problems would occur, but at the time I could push it here and it would fluctuate. But when I moved it 1 unit to the left right here, what actually happened was it stabilized, and that's because the middle square moved on to a different land value tile, and then all these tiles, or some of these tiles, I don't remember which ones, gave it bonus land value, and it was able to stabilize. So that's kind of how residential mids behave. It's more like, okay, If they fluctuate, a police department may actually stabilize them by increasing the land value enough, but it may not. If it doesn't, you need to either reposition the mids, or you need to find a way to give it park, or both. In the case of this residential mid, and this one fluctuates too, again, notice there's no park around it. And so they're fluctuating, which is unfortunate. This one has park around it, but it fluctuates still. So park doesn't always fix it, but it might be a solution. And again, I was pretty disappointed in this, but it's something I would like to try and optimize in the future for this city, is try to reduce the mids. And actually, just to kind of give you an example for this one here, I did find a way to stabilize it after tinkering around for a while. But before I show you that, do you notice that on this one, it looks like it lost power? This is actually a bug in the game. It doesn't actually lose power. It has power, it's just that if you ever give a zone either an invalid destination or it's fluctuating like this, sometimes it will go all the way back to the houses and then pretend it loses power. This is yet again another bug in the game. So just don't worry about that. But let me show you what happens in this case if I do a little bit of tinkering around. So if I were to move the layout like this, what this does is it allows me to put one park of tile right there. And that seemed to be enough to stabilize this. Now, this one doesn't have park, but it seemed okay. And I have this one tiler rail for the commercial top. But because of how valid destinations work, this residential zone ignores it because of these tiles of track, because it uses these first, and then this residential mid gets calculated here, and so this doesn't really bother anything. So if I kind of fast forward, let it develop, it should be stabilized. And so this is a strategy that you're going to need to do, is you might have to think outside the box and find different ways to try and get these residential mids stable. Now, if you end up finishing your city and you have like 3 unstable mids, I call that a victory, because it's a lot easier to pause the game right when those 3 residential mids are fully developed, because what are the chances of trying to get 3 residential mids fully developed? It's pretty high. It's actually not that hard. It's a lot harder to get 11 residential mids fully developed. Having some is okay, but you don't want 11 like me. So I've been going back and trying to figure out ways to make these, because I'd like to go back and try and increase the population and optimize. And this seems to be an optimization that I can do. And notice that this residential mid, this is the one that was fluctuating before, has one tile of park adjacent to it now, and it seems to be stabilized. And if you fast forward and kept going, it would actually stay stable, which is really nice. So I was pretty happy that I was able to find one spot and fix it. However, for spots like this and this, at least for me, it's going to be really difficult to figure out how to fix these, because look how packed in the zones are. And that kind of leads me to the next point that I'd like to talk about. This city has 1,006 developed zones, okay? The world record only has 1,004. And the consequences of having 1,006 zones is it is so packed that I literally can't really shuffle anything around. And what that does, as you can see, is when they're really crammed together, okay, then some of these mids don't have enough land value, but then I can't move anything around or find tiles or rail to give them. So kind of the one of the $1,000,000 questions is more better? Is more zones better, or is less zones better? And while I don't know the exact answer, based off my observations of how my city went, I I'm kind of leaning towards slightly less zones is better, because then that means I have more space to shift things around and put tiles apart. An immediate solution that you might see in this map is, okay, well, if I have a residential mid, maybe I should just build a commercial zone there. So, or a fluctuating residential mid, maybe I should just build a commercial zone because commercial zones don't fluctuate. Well, there's two problems with that solution. Problem one is, again, it's really hard to keep commercial demand up. Number two is, I kind of tried that and I couldn't get my commercial zones to develop all the way. And a fully developed residential mid has 800 and a C4 upper only has 640. So if I can get stable mids, I would have more population. But if you were able to get a lot more residential zones in this map and take away a lot of commercial zones, then you could theoretically replace your residential mids that are fluctuating with commercial zones, because you kind of balanced it out. But you would have to work really hard to make them fully developed uppers or highs. So there's kind of an idea on how you can fix this, but it's not really the best, because again, I'm struggling to keep the RCI meter stable. The commercial zones always crap out, or the commercial demand always decreases all the time during the build, and I can't see how replacing them all with commercial zones would, how I would even do it, at least for now. That's residential mids in a nutshell. They're very unstable, and I think another mistake you're going to do is you're going to say, well, my zones were unstable when I had an invalid destination before. But if you've mastered valid destinations, you should be confident in the track that you give them. And so this one clearly has a valid destination. So it's not fluctuating because of a valid destination if you're confident you have a valid destination, okay? It's fluctuating because it doesn't have enough land value to sustain itself or stabilize. Now, there's a couple other things I would like to show you about residential mids, and actually residential zones in general. Do you notice in my donut blocks, I have residential zones in between them like this? There's a residential mid, there's a residential mid. I could keep going. Look in this corner. I have two residential mids here. Residential mid, upper, mid. And there's like a mid squished here. There's an upper. And then these mids. Look at this. There's one over here and there's one down here. Like, what's going on with that? Well, again, this is just more of an observation that I've made when I was building. But for some reason, if you put residential zones between donut blocks, they will always be stable. Okay, now just to clarify, when I say between, I mean the center. Okay, so the center has to be in between. So see how this zone is sticking out? If this zone were shifted up one, then it would probably even not develop, or it would fluctuate. So as long as the center is somewhere in between two donut blocks like this, the residential zone will always develop all the way and it will stay fully developed. And so that's why I have like this residential top here, because I know it's just going to be stable. And that's why I don't have a problem with any of these residential mids, even in this corner. It's because they're sandwiched between donut blocks. And when you look at this, you can kind of see a pattern here where it's like when you have two donut blocks together, it seems to always be better land value than the outside of the map. But I wouldn't take the colors as, yeah, everything should develop in that, because if you look, let's say right here, right, I have some of those colors between the donut blocks, like right here, yet it did not develop well here. So I'm thinking what's happening here is there's just the zones between the donut blocks always have a guaranteed high enough land value to actually just sustain residential zones. So you might be wondering, okay, then if that's the case, put all residential zones in between. But the reason I don't is A, I use the commercial zones, as you see here, as a valid destination. And B is a lot of them stick up like this, and there's always industrial zones on these edges. In this case, if I made this a residential zone, it would in fact crap out. So I use mostly commercial zones for that. But notice that when you're moving things up like this, you always have room to put another zone. You should always put residential zones here, whether they're mids or not, because they will be stable. It's like literally a freebie. The donut blocks being adjacent to each other produce freebie residential zones in the middle, and you never have to worry about them. You can build them a lot later if you want. These three are all freebies. Okay. Now you might be wondering, like, okay, there's a random residential mid, and then I have a random residential mid here. Well, if you look at the map, do you notice that there's this like one spot up here where it's kind of not dark green, and then you notice a spot here, and actually there's a spot over here, and there's a residential mid as well. What I was doing when I was building at the time was I was struggling to get commercial demand stabilized. So I was finding any spots that I could squeeze more residential zones and remove commercial zones. And it just so happened to be that, yeah, these colors that you see here are kind of the same shade as the gray area, the outer ring, but they had enough land value to keep everything stable. So at the time I built them, but I created a backup just in case they crapped out, and they ended up staying okay. In the case of the one up here, in the case of the one over here, I think it helped that, again, land value is a diamond shape, so the center of the sides have more land value than the corners, which is why these two stayed. And that would actually explain a little bit why this one probably stayed, is because it's kind of near the middle of the bottom map, and it's near water, and it has a lot of land value by it. I think honestly this one, it's just positioned just perfectly. It has just enough park and land value. I think this one more or less I got lucky on, but I'll take it. So if you're working on a different map, basically what I did is I built all my commercial and industrial zones, and then I kind of went back and seen if there was any spots that I could replace any with residential zones. So yeah, that's all I got to say about residential mids. I'm hoping I can try and figure out how to make my fluctuating ones not fluctuate anymore, but that is something to keep in mind when you're building, is if you get residential mids, they are more likely going to be on the outer ring, and the police departments might stabilize them enough to where, or might give them enough land value, just enough to be stabilized, like all of these right here, but then again, they may not, like this one. So if you have a fluctuating residential mid and you tried putting a police department in the area and it didn't help, the next thing you need to do is you need to try to put a tile of park adjacent to it. And the more park, the better. What you're going for here is, if possible, you should put the tile of park in a bonus land value square. It will give it significantly more land value, right? So you want to tinker around with that when you're trying to stabilize residential mids. You could also try and replace one with a commercial zone, but again, I don't suggest that a whole lot unless you definitely have the room to do it. And by room, I mean you have way more residential zones than commercial zones, like way more than I have, okay? And that's how you pretty much tackle your residential mids. They're annoying because, like I said, I know what I'm doing and I have 11 of them. And I really just wanted 4 or 5 probably. And then finally, again, to summarize, you can put residential zones between donut blocks and they will always seem to be stabilized unless, of course, I bulldoze all of this and put an industrial zone right next to it. Okay. So that's all I have about police coverage in residential mids. This is actually the last land value video. We're going to move on in the next videos to other topics concerning building, and hopefully I can make even more sense of what's going on and you will get a better understanding.